She stood at the altar in a dress that didn't belong to her, carrying a secret that could get her killed. Marrying a man who hadn't even asked her name. Until 48 hours ago. The church was silent in the way that only power could make a room silent. Not the silence of reverence. Not the silence of love. It was the silence of fear, the kind that settles into the bones of every person in a room, when the most dangerous man in the city walks through the door. And Elara Voss knew that silence well, because she had been living inside it for the past 3 months. She kept her eyes forward. She held her bouquet of white peonies so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Beneath the cathedral-length veil, no one could see that her lips were trembling. No one could see the tears she was swallowing down with every controlled breath. And no one, not a single person in that entire gilded church, could see the slight curve beneath the empire waist of her gown. The secret she had hidden with careful tailoring and even more careful silence. Elara was 11 weeks pregnant, and the man she was about to marry had no idea. The organ music swelled, and every head in the church turned toward the back. Every eye moved away from her. And in that single moment of collective distraction, Elara let herself breathe. One full, raw, terrified breath, before she locked herself back inside the composure she had been perfecting since the night her entire life had collapsed. She did not look at him when he moved to stand beside her. She couldn't, not yet. Because she knew that if she looked at Dante Moretti, truly looked at him, she would either run or shatter. And she couldn't afford to do either. She only knew his profile from the corner of her eye, the sharp line of his jaw, the dark hair swept back with a kind of effortless authority, the charcoal suit that probably cost more than her mother's house, and the hand steady, still, completely unmoved, folded in front of him as the priest began to speak. He didn't fidget. He didn't glance at her with curiosity or nerves. He simply stood there, radiating a stillness so complete it felt almost like the calm before something catastrophic. And that was the moment Elara understood, something she hadn't fully grasped before. This man wasn't marrying her out of love. He wasn't marrying her out of desire. He was marrying her the same way he would sign a business contract or acquire a property, with total precision, total detachment. The question was, did he already know about the child? And if he did, what on earth did he plan to do about it? To understand how Elara Voss ended up at that altar, you have to go back 6 months. You have to go back to the version of her that still believed in things like loyalty and love and the particular cruelty of a man who knows exactly what he's doing when he looks at you. His name was Sebastian Reeves. And he was the kind of man who made you feel chosen right up until the moment he didn't need you anymore. Elara had met him at a gallery opening on a cold October evening. She was there for work. Not pleasure. She was the creative director for a boutique art house in the city. And gallery openings were part of her professional life, the way grocery runs are part of everyone else's. She had been standing in front of a painting that she privately thought was overpriced and underconceived, holding a glass of champagne she wasn't going to finish, when a voice beside her said, "It looks like someone tried to paint a feeling and gave up halfway through." She had turned and found Sebastian Reeves smiling at her. Dark eyes, easy confidence, the kind of charisma that doesn't announce itself loudly but simply fills whatever space it occupies. What Elara didn't know, or she wouldn't discover until it was far too late, was that Sebastian Reeves was not simply a charming man at a gallery. He was the second son of a mid-level loan shark who owed a significant debt to the Moretti crime family, a debt that had been accumulating for years, a debt that had recently become very, very dangerous. But none of that was visible on that October night. None of that showed in his eyes when he laughed at her dry observation about the painting, or when he asked if she wanted to get terrible coffee from the cart outside, or when he walked her back to her apartment 3 hours later and said he'd never met anyone who thought the way she did. Over the next 5 months, Elara fell, not quickly, not recklessly. She wasn't that kind of woman. She fell the way intelligent women often fall, slowly, carefully, with full awareness that she was falling and the quiet, devastating belief that this time, the landing would be soft. She was wrong. By March, they were living together. By April, she was pregnant. And by May, Sebastian Reeves had packed a single bag and disappeared from her life with nothing but a voicemail she had listened to 11 times in a single night, the words of which had burned themselves into her memory like acid on glass. He said he was sorry. He said he cared about her. He said the situation had become complicated in ways she wouldn't understand. He said he had to go. And then, almost as an afterthought, as if he'd nearly forgotten the most important sentence he'd ever say to her, he said, "Elara, if anyone from the Moretti family contacts you, just do what they say, please. It's the only thing I can ask of you now. She had listened to that voicemail 11 times, and then she had deleted it. And then she had sat on the edge of her bathroom sink for 3 hours, one hand pressed flat against her still flat stomach, and tried to decide what kind of woman she was going to be from this moment forward. She decided she was going to be the kind who survives. She didn't know yet how expensive that decision was going to be. 2 weeks after Sebastian vanished, the knock came. It wasn't a gentle knock. It wasn't the kind of knock that precedes a polite conversation. It was the kind of knock that arrives at 8 in the morning on a Tuesday, and delivered by a man in a black suit who doesn't shift his weight when the door opens, who doesn't apologize for the hour, who simply holds out an envelope and says, with the absolute economy of someone who has delivered many such envelopes, "Mr. Moretti would like to speak with you." Inside the envelope was a single card, black, embossed, a time, an address, and at the bottom, in ink so clean, it looked almost printed, "This is not optional, Elara." When, not because she was weak, not because she was naive. She went because Sebastian's voicemail had planted a seed of understanding in her, and she had spent 2 weeks watering that seed with late nights, internet searches, and fragmented conversations with her one friend who worked in criminal law. She had gathered enough of a picture to know that whatever connection Sebastian had to the Moretti family, it was the kind that didn't dissolve simply because Sebastian had run. Debts, she had learned, rarely disappear. The transfer dot she arrived at the address, a private dining room above an Italian restaurant that occupied an entire city block at exactly the time specified. A man named Marco, who introduced himself as Dante Moretti's right hand, met her at the door and led her through a corridor that smelled of leather and cedar and expensive things. The room was quiet, a single long table, 2 chairs placed at one, and, facing each other with the precision of a negotiation, crystal glasses, already filled with water, a fire in the grate even though it was spring. Dante Moretti was already seated. He stood when she entered, a detail that surprised her, that single gesture of formal courtesy in a room that felt anything but courteous. And then he simply looked at her. She had expected many things from the most feared crime lord in the northeastern corridor. She had expected coldness, overt threat, possibly the theatrical intimidation tactics she'd seen dramatized in every crime film she'd ever watched. She had not expected the quiet. She had not expected the way he watched her cross the room with the expression of a man conducting a very careful, very private assessment. She had not expected to feel, beneath the terror, something uncomfortably close to being truly seen. He was 35, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, with a face that was striking rather than classically handsome, all strong angles and deep-set eyes the color of winter sea glass. He wore his authority the way other men wear cologne, pervasively, without apparent effort. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Dante Moretti picked up his water glass, studied it briefly, and said, "Sebastian Reeves owes my family $800,000. Accrued over 6 years of business arrangements and personal loans made to his father. Sebastian Reeves is no longer findable. You, however, are..." Elara had prepared herself for many opening statements, but one landed the way a stone lands in still water, with a violence of clarity that ripples outward in all directions. She said, "I didn't know about the debt." He said, "I know." She said, "Then you understand I have no means to repay it." He said, "I know that too." Another silence. The fire crackled. Somewhere below them, the restaurant hummed with the oblivious noise of people having dinner. Then Dante Moretti set down his glass, folded his hands on the table in that particular way she would come to recognize as his thinking posture, and said, "I'm not here to collect money from you, Miss Voss. I'm here to make you a proposal." She waited. "My business interests require a certain public image," he said. "My family has been without a matriarch for several years. This creates vulnerabilities, social, political, strategic, that I prefer not to leave unaddressed. I require a wife. Preferably one who is presentable, intelligent, discreet, and who has no particular reason to refuse a significant lifestyle improvement in exchange for cooperation." Elara stared at him. "You're asking me to marry you?" "Yes. You've known me for 4 minutes." Something shifted in his eyes, not humor exactly, but a close neighbor to it. "I've known about you for 2 weeks. The meeting is a formality." She should have said no. Every rational part of her, the part that believed in agency and choice and the basic human right to marry for love, was screaming at her to stand up, walk out, and dare them to stop her. But there was another part of her, the part that was 9 weeks pregnant. The part that had been lying awake every night doing math she couldn't make work. The part that had spent the last 2 weeks staring at a future that looked like a very small, very cold room with a baby she didn't know how to provide for. She said, what would this arrangement look like? And Dante Moretti told her she would live in his home. She would attend events at his side. She would conduct herself with dignity and discretion. She would want for nothing, financially, medically, domestically, nothing. In return, she would ask no questions about his business. She would cause no public scenes. She would maintain the appearance of a functioning marriage for as long as was mutually necessary. And at the end, she asked, when circumstances change, he said, arrangements can be renegotiated. She asked one more question, the only truly personal question she allowed herself in that entire conversation. Why me specifically? If this is a business calculation, surely there are more strategically advantageous options. He held her gaze for a moment that lasted just a fraction too long to be entirely transactional. Then he said, let's just say that Sebastian Reeves, in addition to his financial debts, owes you something. I prefer that someone in this situation benefits from the correction. She didn't fully understand that answer until much later. She said yes, and she'll never not that night. Not in the days of legal preparation that followed. Not on the morning of the wedding told him about the child. The weeks that followed. The wedding was stranger than Elara had anticipated. She had expected coldness. She had expected formal distance, perhaps a kind of controlled contempt. She had expected the household to feel like a gilded prison, and in many ways it did. The Moretti estate was a sprawling stone manor outside the city, surrounded by gates, and guards and a silence that had nothing to do with peace. But the particular texture of that silence was not what she had imagined. Dante Moretti was not cruel to her. He was not warm either. He existed in a register. She didn't have a word for a precise, watchful attentiveness that felt less like indifference and more like a man who had decided to observe before he acted. He was present at dinner most evenings, which surprised her. They ate across from each other at a table far too large for 2 people, and they talked not about his business, never about that, but about books, about architecture, about the particular absurdity of modern art, about the cities he had traveled through and the things that had struck him in each one. He asked questions, and he listened to her answers with a concentration so complete it was almost unnerving, as if her opinions were data he was collecting for a purpose she couldn't yet identify. He never came to her room. He never attempted any kind of intimacy. He treated her, in the most fundamental way, as exactly what she was, a woman in an arrangement entitled to every comfort and none of the complications. And yet, there were moments, small ones. The morning she had been nauseated, badly, silently, unable to hide the pallor, and he had appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at her for a long moment without speaking, then quietly asked the housekeeper to prepare plain toast and ginger tea without explanation. The evening she had fallen asleep in the library over a novel and woken to find a blanket placed over her. The lamp dimmed, the book closed with a marker at her page. The afternoon she'd been on the phone with her mother, who was asking difficult questions about the marriage in a voice that barely concealed its worry. And Dante had walked past the open door, caught her eye through the gap, and given her a single, barely perceptible nod, the kind that says, without any words at all, you're doing fine. She told herself none of it meant anything. She told herself he was simply a man who preferred his household to run smoothly and that extending basic consideration to his resident. Arrangement wife was a matter of domestic efficiency. She almost convinced herself. What she could not navigate, and what grew more urgent with every passing week, was the secret. By the end of their first month of marriage, she was 14 weeks along. The sickness had faded, replaced by a quiet, expanding reality that was becoming physically undeniable. She wore structured clothing. She chose her angles carefully. She became an expert at the art of never being fully observed. But the household had eyes, not malicious ones, mostly, but attentive ones. The housekeeper, a compact, silver-haired woman named Julia who had worked for the Moretti family for 22 years, had begun looking at Elara with an expression that was not quite pithy and not quite knowing but lived somewhere in between. The estate physician, a mild-mannered man named Dr. Ferry who came every other week for routine family health checks, had looked at Elara during her first visit with a long professionally neutral pause before writing his notes. And Marco Dante's shadow and right hand, had watched her from across every room she shared with him with the patient, unreadable gaze of a man who had made a career of knowing things before he was supposed to. She existed in a house full of people who might already know her secret, or might not, and she couldn't ask, and she couldn't tell. And every day that passed was another day the secret became less of a secret and more of an inevitability. It was Marco who broke the silence first. She was in the garden late afternoon, golden light through the hedges, sitting on a stone bench and doing nothing more threatening than reading. He appeared at the garden entrance and stood there until she looked up. "Mrs. Moretti," he said. Just those two words. But in the way he said them, the particular weight he placed on the title, as if reminding her of its protective value, was a full conversation. She held his gaze. Marco, who walked toward her slowly, hands clasped behind his back, and stopped a respectful distance away. Who walked at the book in her hands, then at her face, then briefly, deliberately, at the place where the book rested against her abdomen. "The boss," Marco said carefully, "is a man who notices things. Everything." Eventually Elara said nothing. "He has not asked," Marco continued, "because he made a decision not to ask. Whether you understand why he made that decision." He paused. "That is between the two of you." She swallowed. "Is he angry?" Marco tilted his head slightly, as if the question was more complicated than its surface suggested. "The boss doesn't do angry the way other men do. He does thorough." Another pause. "I would suggest that when the time comes for a conversation, Mrs. Moretti, you are the one who starts it." He turned and walked back toward the house. And Elara sat with the flat afternoon light on her face and her heart hammering in her chest, and the growing, terrible understanding that she had been living inside a man's deliberate, chosen silence, and that silence would not last forever. The months passed away, months. Do when you are waiting for something irrevocable. Slowly, and then all at once. At 17 weeks. She started showing in a way that could not be explained by posture or clothing. At 20 weeks, she went for an ultrasound that Julia accompanied her to without being asked, without comment, appearing at the car the appointed time with a face that said everything and said nothing. At 22 weeks, she held the grainy image of her daughter in her hands and cried in a way she hadn't allowed herself since Sebastian's voicemail. And when she looked up, Julia was sitting across from her in the waiting room with a box of tissues and an expression of such ancient, practiced compassion that Elara understood she was not as alone in this house as she had believed. It was a girl, a small, perfect, entirely uninvited miracle of a girl, who Elara had already decided, in the privacy of her own heart, to name Lena Dart. She had not told Dante. He knew. She was almost certain he knew. But the agreement between them, unspoken, fragile, somehow more dignified than anything she could have negotiated openly, was that she would tell him when she was ready. And she wasn't ready. Not yet. Because readiness required trust, and trust with a man like Dante Moretti was not a thing you built in weeks or months. It was a thing you built in moments. Small ones, accumulated carefully. She was building them slowly, without planning to. The evening she came downstairs at 2 in the morning because she couldn't sleep and found him in the kitchen, jacket removed, sleeves rolled, standing at the island, with a glass of whiskey and a collection of papers spread across the counter in the organized chaos of a man who processes stress through work. Was one such moment. He looked up when she appeared, and neither of them spoke for a beat that stretched just long enough to acknowledge the intimacy of two people seeing each other in the unguarded small hours. He said, "Can't sleep." She said, "Not recently, no." Moved without ceremony to the refrigerator and retrieved a glass container of leftover pasta she hadn't known was there. Put it in the oven, and turned back to his papers with the wordless competence of a man who believes action is a more useful response to most situations than conversation. She sat on a stool at the island and watched the sight of his face while he worked. After a while, she said, "Do you sleep?" "Some nights," he said, without looking up. "What keeps you up on the other nights?" A brief silence. Then the weight of decisions. What they cost. Whether the math was right. He glanced up at her. Looked down at her hands, folded in her lap, directly above the now unmistakable curve of her abdomen. "The future," she said, quietly. "It looks different than I planned." He held her gaze for a moment, steady, unreadable, watchful, and then the oven timer chimed softly, and he turned to get the pasta, and the conversation, such as it was, folded back into the comfortable silence they had somehow learned to share. But something had shifted. She could feel it. The way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. The silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people who had been circling something honest, and are running out of room to keep circling. 2 weeks later, the external world made the decision for her. His name was Vittorio Carbone. He was 66 head, and the head of a rival family from the south whose interests had been colliding with the Moretti empire for the better part of a decade, and at a charity gala where Elara stood at Dante's side in a deep navy gown that she had chosen for its structural elegance and its ability to conceal what was now 24 weeks of undeniable reality. Vittorio Carbone crossed the room toward them with a smile that was all surface and no warmth, and his eyes dropped, deliberately, cruelly, publicly, to Elara's stomach. "Congratulations, Moretti," he said, loud enough for the 6 people standing nearest them to hear. "I see the new bride wasted no time." His eyes slid back up to Dante's face, and in them was a calculation Elara understood immediately. He was testing, he was probing for a crack in the armor. The child must be nearly due by now. Or did the wedding happen rather more urgently than reported? The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. She counted them, for seconds during which the small cluster of people around them went very still, during which Elara felt the blood drain from her face, during which the entire fragile architecture of her secret came apart in public, in a room full of people. Who would remember this moment? And then Dante Moretti turned to look at his wife, not with anger, not with the cold fury she had braced for, the explosive revelation of a man discovering a betrayal. He looked at her with something she hadn't seen in his eyes before, not in all these months of careful distance and kitchen conversations and accumulated small moments. He looked at her with a tenderness so controlled it almost passed for nothing. Almost, but she was close enough. And she had studied his face long enough in the dark hours silence of a house that breathed with secrets, and she caught it. He reached out smoothly, naturally, with the unhurried ease of a man who has never once in his life been rushed by another person, and placed his hand against the curve of her back. Then he looked back at Vittorio Carbone with an expression that had returned to its customary temperature, absolute zero. "The timing of my family's private matters," Dante said, in a voice that was very quiet and therefore very dangerous, "is not a subject for this room, Carbone, nor for any room you occupy." Pause. The hand at her back pressed, barely perceptibly, with a warmth that seemed entirely at odds with the ice in his voice. "Enjoy your evening." He guided her away from the cluster of people with the calm authority of a man who has never once in his life run from anything. And as they moved through the gala, heads turning, whispers trailing them like smoke, Elara became aware of 2 simultaneous and completely contradictory things. She had just been publicly claimed, and she had never felt more terrified in her life. They didn't speak about it until they were home. The car ride was silent. The entrance hall was silent. Julia appeared briefly at the top of the stairs, read the atmosphere with the expertise of a woman who had lived in this house for decades, and disappeared without a word. Elara stopped in the center of the drawing room and turned to face him, because she had decided on the drive home that she was not going to make him wait or chase or ask. She had decided that when this moment came, she would be the one to own it. She was 24 weeks pregnant, and the man standing before her had publicly defended her secret without having been given so much as a single honest word about it. And she owed him the truth, all of it. Without performance or apology, she said, "I was 9 weeks along when we married." He stood near the fireplace, jacket removed now. Watching her with that expression she had spent months trying to decode. She said, "The child is Sebastian Rivas's. I was pregnant before I ever met you. I didn't tell you because..." She paused, searching for the most honest possible version of her reason. "Because I was afraid of what would happen if you knew, and because I needed what you were offering too much to risk it by telling the truth." Silence. She pressed on, because she needed to finish. "I'm not asking you to accept this. I'm not asking you to pretend or continue this arrangement if it's no longer something you want, but I couldn't keep not telling you. Not after she..." Stopped. "No, not after tonight." The fire crackled behind him. He was very still. Then Dante Moretti crossed the room slowly, unhurriedly, in the way that characterized everything he did, and stopped in front of her at a distance that was neither intimate nor formal. He looked at her face for a long moment. Then his gaze moved, for the first time openly and without the studied casualness with which he had always avoided it, to the rounded evidence of her pregnancy. He said, "I know it's not mine." She stared. At whom you knew, within the first 3 weeks. His voice was quiet, not accusatory, not cold, simply factual, the way a man states things he has long since processed. Julia confirmed what I already suspected. Dr. Ferry confirmed the rest. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Then why? She managed. Did you never say anything? He looked at her again, and this time the thing she had caught in his eyes at the gala was fully present, visible, unguarded, something that seemed to cost him in the showing of it. He said, because the child needed a safe place to be born, and you needed a safe place to be. A pause. And because Reeves made choices that harmed you. I don't punish the innocent for the crimes of the guilty. She felt tears arriving with the speed and force of something she'd been holding back for. Muncie pressed her lips together, hard. He said, "Are you all right?" She managed. "Barely. I'm trying to be." He nodded once, as if that was a satisfactory answer. Then he said, "The child will have my name, if that's what you want. It changes nothing about our arrangement unless you want to change it." Another pause, and this one held something that hadn't been in the previous ones. Something tentative, something that was entirely at odds with everything authoritative and impenetrable about him. "I would prefer to change it, but that is this decision to make, not mine." She looked at him for a long time. The fire, the room, the weight of months of carefully maintained distance, the accumulation of small moments she hadn't meant to collect and couldn't uncollect, she said. What would changing it look like? And for the first time since she had known him, Dante Moretti smiled. Not widely, not with the ease of a man who smiles often, but genuinely a small, barely visible shift that transformed the landscape of his face in a way that made her understand, with sudden and devastating clarity, that he was not what she had thought he was. He was not simply cold. He was not simply calculating. He was a man who had built walls so high for so long that the act of showing her the inside of them was, for him, the most vulnerable thing in the world. He said, "I think we start by having dinner somewhere that..." Isn't this how she laughed? Which surprised them both. The laugh was real and sudden and slightly tearful, and it broke something open in the air between them that had been sealed. Since that first meeting in the private dining room, she said. "Tomorrow," he said. Tomorrow. But the world that Dante Moretti inhabited did not afford him the luxury of uncomplicated things. And the particular thread that had been building in the background, the Carbone family, Vittorio's cold smile at the gala, the provocation delivered with such precision into the most vulnerable possible moment, was not finished. 3 days after their first honest conversation, Marco appeared in the morning room where Elara was having breakfast, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen him wear before. He said, "Mrs. Moretti, I need you to stay inside the estate. Today, and possibly tomorrow." She put down her coffee. "What's happened?" he said. "Nothing yet. We'd like to keep it that way." What she learned, over the following 24 hours, was assembled from fragments, a word from Julia, an over-phone conversation, the particular quality of controlled urgency that moved through the household like a cold current. The Carbone family had made a move. Not a violent one, not yet, but a move designed to destabilize, to embarrass, to strip away the armor of a man whose power depended on the perception of invulnerability. Someone had leaked information to a tabloid publication, but the nature of Elara's pregnancy, the timeline, the clear implication that Dante Moretti's new bride had come to him, already carrying another man's child, and that the fiat head of the Moretti family had either been deceived or had accepted the situation in a way that invited questions about his authority. The story ran on at Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, Elara had read it 3 times on her phone and was sitting in the library trying to breathe steadily, and Dante had been in his office for 6 hours, straight with the door closed and 4 of his most senior men cycling in and out with the grim efficiency of people managing something large and potentially explosive. He found her at 7 in the evening. She looked up when he came in, and she said, before he could speak, "I'm sorry. I know this is because of me." He walked to the chair opposite hers and sat down, and he looked at her with a focused directness that had no distance in it at all. "This is because of Carbone," he said. "Not you. He used me. He used what he thought was a vulnerability. He was mistaken." A pause. "Everything that has appeared in that article is known to me. Nothing in it changes anything about this house or this family. The only question now is how we respond." She studied his face. "How do we respond?" He said, publicly. "Together, on our own terms. What followed was something Elara had not anticipated when she had imagined the life she might lead inside a marriage of arrangement. Dante Moretti did not manage the crisis with suppression or threat or the kind of brutal remedy she had half expected from a man of his world. He managed it with something almost shockingly human. He took her to dinner, the most visible restaurant in the city, the following Saturday evening, with a reservation made under his own name, at the best table in the room, in full view of every set of eyes that mattered and every camera that was likely to be present. He arrived at her door at 7:45 in an evening suit so precisely pressed it seemed to make the air around him more formal, and he looked at her in a deep wine-colored dress that she had chosen with a particular defiance of a woman who has nothing left to hide, and he said, "You look extraordinary." She said, "You're laying it on a bit thick for someone who claims to be operating strategically." He offered his arm, who says strategy and honesty can't coexist. They sat across from each other at that restaurant table for 3 hours, and if the eyes of the entire room were on them, and neither of them acknowledged it. They talked, they ate, they argued gently about a film she had seen, and he hadn't, and about whether a particular novelist's later work held up against his earlier period. They drank her water and him wine, and at some point in the second hour she forgot entirely that they had an audience. She forgot entirely that this had begun as performance. He reached across the table at one point, while she was making a particularly emphatic point about narrative structure and emotional honesty in fiction, a topic she had apparently strong feelings about, and placed his hand briefly over hers, not for the cameras, not for anyone watching. Too small, too quiet, too genuine. She stopped mid-sentence. He looked at her steadily, and she understood that whatever this was, this slow, strange, entirely unplanned thing that had been building in the spaces between arrangement and reality, it was no longer something either of them was going to pretend wasn't happening. The time the photographs appeared, they told a completely different story than Carbone had intended. 3 weeks before her due date, Elara's world changed again. This time, quietly, and from a direction she hadn't been watching. She received an email. No preamble, no explanation. A 6-line message from a lawyer representing Sebastian Reeves. He had been found. He had been living under an assumed identity, in a city 3 countries away. He had, apparently, been doing so for the past 7 months. And now, his lawyer wrote, he wished to be kept informed of the status of the child. Elara sat with that email for 3 hours. Then she forwarded it to Dante with a single line, "I think we need to talk about this." He came home early. They sat in the library, their library. She had started thinking of it that way, and she watched his face as he read the email. And she saw something she hadn't seen before. Not rage, not exactly. Something more controlled than rage, and more dangerous for its control. The particular expression of a man who has spent years building a system of protection around something, only to find the thing he has been protecting has attracted unwanted attention from precisely the quarter he had been managing. He said, "He has no legal standing." She said, "He abandoned you." Dante's voice was very even. "He left you with a debt, a pregnancy, and a voicemail. He has no legal standing, and no moral standing. He will not approach this child," she said. "It might not be as simple as that." He looked at her. "Elara, trust me to handle this." She had not, until that moment, used his name with any regularity. It was another of the small distances she had maintained. She reached across and covered his hand with hers, returning with a full-circle symmetry she hadn't planned, the gesture he had made in the restaurant, and she said, "Okay." He turned his hand over and held hers. They stayed like that for a while in the quiet of the library, while outside the estate's walls the city moved through its oblivious evening, and Elara thought about the particular geometry of her life, the choices and catastrophes and pieces of extraordinary luck, terrible and good, that had assembled themselves into this strange, improbable present, a man she had married in fear, sitting across from her now in something that felt nothing like fear at all. She said, quietly, "I didn't plan any of this." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm not sorry it happened." A beat then, "Neither am I." Lena Moretti arrived on a Thursday morning in October, precisely 3 days after her due date, during a rainstorm that had been building 4 days. The labor was long, 12 hours, beginning in the quiet dark of 3 in the morning and ending just after dawn when the rain finally broke and the light that came through the hospital windows was new and clean and gold. Julia was there, because Elara had asked her and because Julia had not waited to be asked twice. And Dante was there. He had not left. Not for the entire 12 hours. He had sat at her side through the difficult hours, and there were difficult hours, and there were difficult hours, long ones, during which Elara's composure fractured and reassembled itself repeatedly, and she said things she wouldn't remember clearly later. And he had been present in the most fundamental way, not performing support, not managing the situation, simply there in the way that matters more than anything, consistently, quietly, entirely. When Lena was placed in Elara's arms 4 minutes past 8 in the morning, wrinkled and furious, and perfect in the exact particular way that every new human being is perfect, Elara looked down at her daughter and felt the thing she had been protecting herself from feeling for 9 months finally arrive with its full, devastating force, love, absolute and terrifying and enormous. She looked up. Dante was standing beside the bed, looking at the child with an expression she had never seen on his face before. The stillness that characterized him was still present, but transformed, not the stillness of control but the stillness of wonder. He looked like a man who has spent years moving through a world he understood completely and has just encountered, for the first time, something he doesn't know what to do with. Elara said, softly, "Do you want to hold her?" He looked at her, and the answer was in his face before he said anything, visible and unguarded, and so completely honest that she felt it like a physical thing. He sat carefully on the edge of the chair beside the bed, and Elara placed Lena in his arms with the precise, awkward tenderness of handing someone something priceless. He held her daughter. He held her with the careful steadiness of a man who handles things he intends never to drop, and he looked at her, this small, screaming, entirely independent person who had come into his life sideways and by accident and through a chain of events that began with someone else's debt and someone else's cowardice, and his face did something remarkable. It let go, not of everything, not all at once, but enough. The last layer of the careful, constructed distance, the final wall that had been standing. She realized now, not just between them but between him and something he had been protecting himself from for a very long time, came down. Giulia, standing near the window with her practical silver competence, made no comment, but she turned toward the rain-brightened window, and Elara could see, from across the room, that the woman was smiling. In the weeks that followed, Sebastian's lawyer sent 2 more emails. They went unanswered. Then, through channels Elara did not inquire into and Dante did not explain, they stopped. She didn't ask how. She had learned that there were parts of his world she would coexist with without needing to illuminate them. And she had learned that the protection he extended was not the possessive, controlling kind that diminishes the person it covers. It was the kind that holds space. The kind that says, "I will take care of the things that threaten you, so that you can take care of the things that matter." What mattered, in the month of Lena's arrival, was everything else. Lena, who had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn lower lip, who slept in the night nursery that Julia and Elara had furnished together in warm ivory and soft sage, who screamed magnificently at 3 in the morning with an authority that Elara privately found hilarious, and Dante privately found something he couldn't name but which kept him returning to the nursery doorway more often than she'd expected. She caught him there, 3 weeks after Lena came home. 2 in the morning, the house quiet. She had gotten up for the feeding and found him already in the nursery doorway, not inside. Just at the threshold, watching the child in the crib with an expression that was simply, completely open. She stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "She has your stubbornness," Elara said. "How on earth can you tell that already?" "The way she holds her fists when she sleeps," he said, "like she's ready to argue with whatever she's dreaming about." She laughed, and the laugh was a real one, warm and quiet so as not to wake Lena, but entirely unguarded. And he turned toward the sound of it, toward her, and the look on his face in the soft nursery light was the most honest thing she had ever seen a man direct at her. He said, "I'd like to be her father, if that's something you'd allow." The word allow struck her. This man who allowed nothing, who demanded everything, who moved through the world with an authority that bent it to his will, using the word allow in the context of something. He wanted the extraordinary vulnerability of it, she said. "I think Lena would like that very much." A pause. "And you?" She looked at him for a long moment. The nursery around them, the sleeping child, the months of accumulated small moments and honest conversations, and the enormous, strange, irreversible fact of where they had arrived. She said, "I'm not sure when this stopped being an arrangement." He said, "I know exactly when." She waited. "The night you fell asleep in the library," he said. over the novel. I put the blanket over you and you murmured something in your sleep without waking. Something about the ending being wrong. A very slight pause. I stood there for probably too long and I thought I'm in trouble. She stared at him. That was 3 weeks after the wedding. I know, he said. She took this in. The months of kitchen conversations and measured distance and deliberate patience, all of it, visible now from the other side. A man who had known what was happening and chosen, with characteristic precision, to give her all the time she needed, who had held the door open without pushing it. She said, "You could have told me." He said, "You needed to arrive at it yourself." I know the difference between a woman who chooses and a woman who feels she has no choice. I wanted you to choose. Something cracked open in her chest with the slow, irreversible completeness of ice breaking in spring. She reached up and touched his face, just one hand, her palm against the line of his jaw, and he went very still. Under her touch, with the stillness of something that has been waiting a long time, she said, "I choose." Behind them, Lena stirred in her crib, made one small indignant sound, and settled back into sleep. And in the soft light of the nursery, with the city quiet beyond the estate walls, and a child sleeping between them in every sense that mattered, Elara Voss, Elara Moretti, understood something that she had not understood on the day she had stood at that altar. Terrified and hidden and holding white peonies too tightly, that the life you plan and the life you get are almost never the same thing, that the people who find you when everything has fallen apart are sometimes the people who stay longest when everything is rebuilt. That love, real love, not the kind that performs itself loudly in easy circumstances, but the kind that shows up at 3 in the morning in a nursery doorway, that drives you to a hospital and stays for 12 hours, that defends you in front of a room full of people with a hand at your back and a voice like winter. That kind of love doesn't announce itself. It simply accumulates, quietly, in moments too small to be called romantic and too significant to be called nothing. That the most dangerous man in the city had been, from the very beginning, the safest place she'd ever stood. 6 months later, on a Sunday morning in April, when the garden of the Moretti estate was doing the first tentative things that gardens do after a long winter, the first green-yellow light through the new leaves, the old stone walls warm in the early sun, Elara sat on the bench where Marco had once spoken to her about chosen silences, and she held her daughter against her chest, and she watched Dante walk toward them across the grass. He was in his dark hair slightly undone from its usual precision, the way it got on weekend mornings. On the mornings when the world's requirements briefly receded and left room for something quieter, he'd carried 2 coffee cups, because he had learned her preference over months of shared mornings, and he carried them with the same absolute steadiness with which he carried everything. He sat beside her, he handed her the coffee. He looked at Lena, who was studying the garden with the fierce, concentrated attention of a 6-month-old encountering the world's complexity for the first time, and he said, "She's looking at that bird like she's deciding whether to make an offer on it." Elara laughed. "She has her father's negotiating instincts." The word landed between them, father, and he looked at Elara with an expression that she had catalogued by now, that she knew by heart, the one that lived in the territory between profound and unutterable. He reached across and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and the gesture was so tender and so unhurried that it felt like a language all its own. She leaned into his shoulder. Lena grabbed a handful of her mother's cardigan and held on with the unreasonable grip of a person who has just discovered something worth holding. The garden was warm. The city was far away. And the particular silence that existed in that moment was not the silence of fear or power or carefully managed distance. It was the silence of something whole. A year ago, Elara had stood at an altar she hadn't chosen, carrying a secret she was terrified of. Marrying a man she didn't know. She had been right to be afraid. Just not for the reasons she'd thought. She had been afraid of the wrong things, the arrangement, the contract, the coldness she had anticipated. She had not been afraid of the thing that was actually dangerous, the thing she had never managed to build a wall against, the slow, undeniable, entirely uninvited way she had come to love him. And if she had known, if she had stood at that altar and known the whole story. The kitchen at 2 in the morning and the library blanket and the nursery doorway and this Sunday morning in April, would she have been afraid? She thought about that sometimes, and every time she arrived at the same answer, no. She would have walked down that aisle a little faster. What no one tells you about the kind of life that looks, from the outside, like it was built by force or fear or necessity, is that the things built under pressure are sometimes the truest things. that a marriage begun without love can become, through the accumulated weight of honest moments, the most loving thing a person has ever known. That a man capable of great darkness can choose, every single day, to direct his formidable nature toward protection rather than power. That a woman capable of great fear can choose, in a nursery doorway on an ordinary night, to be courageous, and that a child, a small, furious, fist-clenching, bird-evaluating daughter of a complicated love, can be the gravity that pulls two careful people finally toward each other. Lena grew. The Moretti estate stayed standing, as it had for decades, against all the pressures the world applied to it. Marco remained in his watchful post, though Elara noticed, over time, that the watchfulness had shifted from assessment to something closer to protective affection. Julia continued to appear at precisely the moments she was needed, which Elara eventually accepted as one of the fundamental laws of the household. Sebastian Reeves was never heard from again. Vitor Scarbone had a very public and professionally catastrophic year. And Dante Moretti, the most feared man in the city, the man of absolute stillness, and winter sea-glass eyes and hands that never once shook, that man was routinely and completely undone by a 6-month-old who had decided that his shoulder was the most suitable sleeping location in the building. He never objected, not even once.